New York moved by two rhythms. The day belonged to noise, the night to control. When the sun fell behind the Hudson, another city came alive, one that didn't punch clocks or sign receipts. It lived in the pulse of bass lines and cash draws. The music started where daylight rules ended. Behind every club door, money waited for the right hands to move it. If you love stories about power, control, corruption, and hidden empires in plain sight, make sure to follow, because this one ends with an empire built on the night collapsing under its own weight. New York City, summer 1970. The streets glowed damp, reflecting neon from liquor stores and movie marquees. Cabs drifted slow, radio static mixing with disco that hadn't yet found its name. At the corner of 8th Avenue and 44th, a bouncer in a fitted shirt watched the crowd line up outside a narrow doorway. The club was small, dark, and already full. Inside, cash traveled faster than light. One bartender poured, one collected, one passed envelopes under the counter. Nobody looked nervous. They were used to the system. The mob didn't invent nightlife. It discovered it and realized it could own it. The same men who handled garbage routes and construction bids now handled bar licenses and bouncers. They called it protection, but it worked like rent. A manager could run his place in peace as long as the right envelopes went out on Thursday. Miss 1 week and the next delivery never showed up. There were no warnings, only absence. The city accepted this as natural. It kept the noise organized. At first it was small. A bar here, a strip joint there, each paying for safety that City Hall couldn't offer. Police looked away. Some got their own cut through quiet intermediaries. The workers didn't mind. To them, this wasn't crime. It was insurance that actually answered the phone. A bartender's cousin could lose his temper, break a glass, and still keep his job because the owner's friends smoothed it over. Fairness didn't come from law. It came from connection. In those early years, the night still felt friendly. Disco lights blinked over faces that trusted each other. The collectors came alone, polite, hands clean. They drank soda instead of liquor, smiled at dancers, tipped heavy. The club owners kept ledgers that matched only in memory. Every Thursday was accounting day. By Friday, the floorboards shook with laughter and music, and everyone forgot what the envelopes meant. The bosses saw possibility. They learned that people would pay anything for permission to enjoy themselves. They began buying silent shares in bars that already worked, leaving the names on the leases untouched. A club could look independent, but still answer to an office uptown. The owners signed whatever papers were put in front of them, because business was good and questions were expensive. The real money came from movement, liquor shipments, cab rides, coat checks, and every dollar that changed hands after dark. The city had problems bigger than nightlife. Power shortages, layoffs, empty buildings, streets uncollected of trash. But the clubs thrived because they ran on human rhythm, not civic order. Bartenders knew that if lights failed, candles appeared. If cops raided, calls went out, and by the next night everything was back in place. There was always someone above someone else making sure the machine turned. It wasn't legal, but it was efficient. Cab drivers were part of the same clock. They carried dancers, waiters, and customers between bars, always knowing which corners were safe to stop. Some routes were spoken for. A driver who ignored invisible borders found his tires slit, or his shift cut short by words that sounded friendly but weren't. The smarter ones learned fast, kept quiet, and made a living. The night belonged to those who understood rhythm, cash in, cash out, no noise in between. By 72, the city's nightlife had turned into a network. 8th Avenue to Midtown, Queens Boulevard to the Bronx. Every bar connected by unseen threads. Collectors traveled predictable loops, never rushed, never late. A club that paid stayed open. A club that didn't become a story. Dancers talked about it backstage, lighting cigarettes with shaking hands. They weren't scared so much as reminded. The system worked because everyone believed in it. You could set your watch by the knock on the back door. Some of the men running collections came from the same neighborhoods as the workers. They weren't monsters. They liked baseball, family dinners, weekend drives. They carried themselves with easy confidence that came from knowing they'd never wait in line. They didn't threaten unless forced. Their real power came from memory. Who owed what, who paid late, who kept quiet. Respect was currency heavier than cash. Lose it, and the night stopped trusting you. Dancers and bartenders learned unwritten etiquette. Smile, keep change ready. Never ask who signed the paychecks. The women knew which customers mattered and which didn't. The men knew when to pour free and when to close the tab early. Everybody played their part. The mob's influence wasn't about fear, it was about timing. The city moved smoother when everyone knew their place. By 1974, disco had exploded. Music that started in basements filled entire blocks. Clubs grew from corner bars to palaces of mirrored walls and velvet ropes. The bigger the crowd, the bigger the envelope. A new class of managers appeared. Sharp suits, gold chains, smiles too quick. They spoke both languages, business and street. They made sure the right bottles were stocked and the right people got through the door. Behind every grand opening stood the same quiet hands arranging deliveries, licenses and protection. The regulars didn't care who owned what. They came for release, for 2 hours when the world made sense. Under the colored lights, strangers danced like family. The city outside could crumble, but inside, music drowned worry. In those rooms, the mob wasn't an enemy. It was a guarantee. The crowd could party because someone was always watching the door. A Friday night in '75 looked like a photograph come alive. Polyester shirts, wide collars, gold necklaces flashing against sweat. The bartenders moved fast, counting by feel. Cash drawers overflowed, and nobody asked for receipts. Outside, engines idled, cabs waited, deals continued on sidewalks. The city's pulse ran loud but steady. It was organized chaos, and at the center of that rhythm stood men who never appeared on stage. They didn't need spotlights. Their presence lived in the small order of things. The club that never got robbed, the dancer who always made it home safe, the bar that never ran out of beer. Every favor carried memory, every silence, trust. For now it worked. The night was theirs. By 1976, the city's heartbeat grew faster. The night had become a business that no one admitted existed, but everyone depended on. Cash ruled, and cash never slept. Club owners learned that if you kept the music loud, the lights low, and the envelopes ready, the city would leave you alone. People lined up outside because they trusted that once they crossed the threshold, everything worked. Drinks poured, music played, and money kept moving. The collectors started wearing newer suits, brighter watches, thicker ties. They looked more like club owners than debt men. They smiled wider, stayed longer, tipped heavier. They had grown from visitors to fixtures, blending in with the very nightlife they managed. For bartenders and dancers, that change felt natural. The lines between owner, worker, and protector blurred until nobody could tell who answered to whom. Every club had a rhythm. Thursdays were for payouts, Fridays for crowds, Saturdays for stories. Monday nights were quiet, but even quiet had a cost. If the week went smooth, collectors bought a round. If someone forgot their part, the silence changed. The music still played, but people noticed the difference. Eyes moved quicker, voices dropped. The city's nightlife had learned to read tone as clearly as time. By now, the mob had its hands in every layer of the night. The truck drivers who brought liquor to the bars, the landlords who controlled rent, the doormen who decided who entered, the cabbies who circled the blocks, waiting for closing time. Even coat check attendants passed part of their tips to stay on the right side of peace. Nobody argued because the system worked. If you followed rhythm, you stayed safe. Clubs in Midtown were packed so tight it felt like the walls were sweating. 1,000 people in one room, lights spinning, bass pounding through the floor. The air smelled of perfume, beer, and heat. Managers walked the floor with eyes sharp enough to spot trouble before it started. They knew their bosses didn't like noise that wasn't music. Behind them, bookkeepers stacked cash in neat, rubber-banded piles. It never hit the bank. The money flowed through hands that left no fingerprints. Some clubs became legend. Studio doors on West 54th where everyone wanted to be seen, and nobody cared who owned it. Rumors floated about silent partners who didn't dance but controlled the DJs. The truth stayed unspoken. A successful club wasn't about luxury. It was about permission to break rules without consequence. That permission was bought one envelope at a time. Cab drivers called it the Loop. They circled from 8th Avenue to West Broadway, from the strip bars to the new discos. The fares were good, the tips better. They picked up dancers heading home, managers heading to after-hours bars. customers too drunk to find their own street. They all told stories that ended the same way. Someone had friends who made sure they got home safe. Drivers didn't ask names. They just nodded, drove, and counted. The system had matured. Violence was rare because it was bad for business. The men running things preferred efficiency over fear. They solved problems the same way they handled schedules, quietly. A club that caused trouble lost its deliveries or its license, and everyone learned from the example. It was the city's unspoken balance. The mob kept the night safe from chaos, and the people paid for that safety in small, steady ways. Dancers felt it most. They knew who to smile at, who to avoid, and when to look down. They weren't victims. They were survivors who understood the trade. The bosses didn't have to say much. One glance across the room meant a lot. The women earned, saved, and moved with care. In dressing rooms lined with mirrors, they folded bills into garters and talked about opening beauty shops or leaving for Florida. Some did. Most stayed. The night was their job, their safety, their identity. For bartenders, the rules were simple. Never short the register. Never talk out of place. Always pour one for the collector when he came in, even if he didn't drink. They learned small habits that became instinct. Counting the drawer twice, keeping extra cash in a hidden pocket, pretending not to hear when names were mentioned. They didn't think of it as fear. It was routine, the kind that made life predictable. By 1978, the city was louder, brighter, hungrier. New clubs opened every month, bigger and flashier than the last. The mob didn't need to push. The expansion came naturally. The economy of pleasure was too strong to slow down. People wanted escape, and the mob sold escape with precision. You could walk into a bar with $10 and leave broke, but unhurt. You could make rent one night at a time, serving drinks or dancing under lights. It was survival with rhythm. But under the polish, small cracks started forming. Younger collectors entered the business without patience. They talked louder, dressed sharper, wanted faster money. The old hands watched and stayed silent. They knew speed was dangerous. The new ones didn't listen. They saw the crowds and thought control meant ownership. Respect began to slip into pride, and pride didn't fit well in that world. The city itself reflected the change. Streets that once felt personal now felt crowded. The clubs turned into factories, money moving faster than conversation. Regulars noticed collectors coming in pairs now, not alone. They stayed longer, counted cash openly, smiled less. Bartenders joked less. Dancers watched more. Nothing exploded, but everyone felt the tension. It was like music turned up too high, thrilling at first, then exhausting. The bosses sitting in back rooms felt it too. They watched the young men running things and saw ambition where discipline used to be. They didn't say much. The old rules still existed. Don't draw heat, don't get greedy, don't get famous. But the city was changing. Fame had become its own currency. Every man wanted to be seen. The night that once thrived on secrecy now flirted with exposure. Still, the machine kept running. The envelopes arrived, the music played, the cabs circled, the clubs filled. To most people, it was just another good year. But to those who paid attention, something had shifted. The rhythm was a little faster, the smiles a little tighter. The peace that once felt permanent now depended on luck. Nobody said it out loud, but the night had started leaning forward, moving towards something it couldn't stop. The city's heartbeat was still steady, but underneath a second beat was growing, one that sounded like warning. By 1979, the night had grown louder than sense. What began as a working man's escape had become an empire that forgot its own limits. Clubs that once ran on quiet discipline now glowed like trophies. The people inside dressed richer, laughed harder, spent faster. Even the men who collected the envelopes started believing the show was theirs. The rhythm that once meant order was now feeding itself. Money flowed like water. Everyone touched it, few kept it. The old bosses used to say the trick was to take a small bite and let the rest keep moving. The new ones took handfuls. They spent on cars, rings, and weekends that stretched into weeks. Respect started turning into noise. Bartenders heard rumors that made them uneasy, collectors arguing in back rooms, new faces taking old routes. The peace that used to settle over closing time had turned to tension. For dancers, the signs showed early. A missing paycheck here, a new rule there. The managers became sharper, their smiles thinner. Women who complained found their shifts shortened or their tips adjusted. The quiet understanding that had kept the system fair was slipping. Some nights men who weren't supposed to be there showed up to check the numbers. The women kept moving, pretending nothing changed. Pretending worked better than protest. Cab drivers noticed too. Streets that were once divided by invisible borders started bleeding into each other. Young drivers without memory of the old rules began crossing lines. They thought the danger was a story, not a map. Tires got slashed, radios disappeared, but the message didn't stick like before. Fear had turned into frustration. A system built on respect was now running on momentum, and momentum never stops to listen. By 1980, the city looked alive but felt uneasy. The clubs stayed open later, the crowds grew younger, and the collectors came more often. Some carried briefcases instead of envelopes. They used words like investment and expansion, as if the night had become a business you could advertise. The old bosses frowned but said nothing. They knew that greed can't be taught out of a man. It burns itself out. They just hoped it wouldn't take the whole city with it. Inside the clubs, music changed. Guitars gave way to recorded beats that never ended. The tempo matched the new attitude. Constant, hard, restless. The lights flashed faster, the drinks poured stronger, and the nights stretched longer. The bartenders moved like machines, their faces calm but eyes calculating. Every extra hour meant extra risk, but nobody wanted to be the one who closed early. The money was too good, the pressure too real. The collectors started showing impatience. They didn't want routine anymore, they wanted results. They checked ledgers, questioned managers, demanded proof. A missed envelope wasn't a delay now, it was disrespect. The small talk disappeared. The easy smiles faded. The relationship between owners and protectors turned cold. What had once been partnership began to feel like surveillance. Still, the system held, because everyone was tied to it. The bartenders needed their jobs, the dancers needed safety, the cabbies needed routes, the bosses needed money. So they worked harder, spoke less, and hoped the tension would settle. But tension doesn't fade on its own, it looks for release. The older men tried to slow things down. They called meetings in quiet restaurants where nobody raised their voice. They talked about how the city was changing. New mayors, new laws, new faces in uniform. They warned that the night needed to stay quiet, but the young collectors weren't listening. They thought silence was weakness. They believed that fear worked faster than respect. They didn't understand that fear burns out a city faster than fire. The first real crack came small. A club owner on the Lower West Side tried to hold back a week's payment, claiming low turnout. The collector didn't wait or ask questions. He made a scene. The bar went silent, the story spread, and the spell broke. Suddenly, everyone realized how thin the rules had become. The old collectors would have handled it with a handshake, the new ones left bruises. The night had lost its manners. Bartenders felt it immediately. They stopped relaxing after shifts. They watched doors even when they poured. Dancers started hiding their tips in shoes again, just like the old days. Cabbies began skipping pickups near certain blocks. Fear returned, not the clean kind that kept order, but the messy kind that made people second guess. It wasn't business anymore. It was pressure without purpose. Yet to outsiders, the city looked better than ever. The lights brighter, the lines longer, the photos flashier. Tourists came chasing danger like it was part of the ticket price. The local papers called it New York at its peak. They didn't know the peak is the moment before the fall. The people who worked those nights could feel it, a sense that something was ending even as the money piled higher. By 1983, the bosses stopped coming to the clubs. They preferred quiet rooms, smoked cigars that went out before they finished, and stared at ledgers they no longer trusted. They knew what was happening. You can't run a city on noise forever. The collectors who replaced respect with pressure were making money, but they were losing control. The night had become unpredictable, and unpredictability was death to their kind of order. Down at street level, the change was visible in faces. Bartenders smiled less, dancers laughed softer. The easy rhythm of trust was gone. The night that had once protected its people now made them nervous. Still, everyone kept showing up because routine is stronger than fear. They told themselves it would pass, it never did. By 84, the stories were everywhere. A manager disappeared. A driver quit after being followed home. A dancer found a new job in a cleaner club uptown. Each story carried the same quiet message. The night was no longer safe. The old codes were broken, replaced by noise that nobody understood. But the music kept playing. People still lined up, still paid cover, still danced. The night was dying, but it died beautifully, bright, loud and crowded. The city moved to the same beat, pretending nothing had changed. Pretending always worked, until the pretending stopped being enough. And in back rooms across Manhattan, men who once ruled without lifting a hand began to realize they were losing the only thing that ever mattered: control. By 1985, the night still glittered, but its shine felt hollow. Clubs stayed open past 4, lights pulsing, bass heavy, laughter stretched thin. People danced harder, drank faster, tipped bigger. They were chasing something that used to come easy, the feeling that someone was in charge and the city would hold together until morning. Now that feeling was gone, replaced by noise that wouldn't quiet. Owners whispered about collectors they didn't recognize. One week the envelope went to a familiar face, the next to a stranger with the same grin but colder eyes. The new men wanted more, quicker. They talked about territories and profits instead of peace. They didn't remember that too much attention kills a business faster than debt. Outside, squad cars cruised slower, cameras flashed brighter, reporters started to circle. The mob had never loved the spotlight, but the spotlight found them anyway. Inside the bars, old habits began to fade. Bartenders who once trusted a handshake started demanding signatures. Dancers stopped leaving bags in dressing rooms. Cab drivers double-locked doors and stopped waiting outside the big clubs. The small gestures that kept the city safe, a nod, a glance, a shared cigarette, were disappearing. The night that once worked like a single heartbeat had broken into scattered pulses. Some of the old bosses tried to patch it back together. They sent familiar faces to calm the streets, to remind people of the old ways. But the city had changed. The economy was harder, rents higher, people meaner. The new generation didn't care about rules made in basements 20 years earlier. They wanted quick money, fast music, and no obligations. The quiet control that had made the system human no longer fit the speed of the 80s. In the clubs, the change showed first in sound. Live bands disappeared, recorded tracks took over, the same rhythm every night. Managers who once counted cash by hand now used machines. The bartenders moved faster, less friendly. The dancers smiled less, stayed closer to mirrors, always watching the crowd. It wasn't fear, it was fatigue. They'd seen too many faces come and go, too many promises unkept. The trust that once made the work feel steady was gone. Some clubs tried to go straight. They filed for real licenses, paid real taxes, hired guards with badges. But going clean meant smaller profits, and smaller profits meant fewer friends. Others stayed dirty and paid the price. Raids, closures, lost permits. The night was getting squeezed from both ends. The mob still had power, but it was scattered, more memory than structure. Even the collectors complained that nothing ran on time. They missed the days when an envelope meant peace and a handshake meant truth. By 86, the people who lived the nightlife could feel they were part of something ending. They didn't talk about it, but they felt it in small moments. A song finishing without applause, a bar closing early, a regular who didn't come back. The energy that had once held the city together was burning out. Bartenders looked older, dancers quieter, cabbies tired. The bosses kept counting, but the numbers no longer meant control. Money without order was just noise, and the night had turned noisy. One night a collector hit a club too hard. A bartender tried to intervene and ended up in the hospital. The story spread faster than music. It wasn't the first act of violence, but it was the one that broke faith. People stopped believing that the system protected them. They began handling problems alone, calling their cousins, hiring their own guards, locking their own doors. The chain of trust snapped, link by link. After that, the city began to change its face. Bright new signs replaced old ones. Bars turned into restaurants, strip clubs into lounges. You could still drink, still dance, but the soul was different. The new managers wore suits from stores, not tailors. The jukebox gave way to sound systems that played the same songs everywhere. For the first time you could have fun without knowing anyone. That was progress, people said, but progress felt cold. The men who had built the old order faded quietly. Some went to prison, some to Florida, some just disappeared. The ones who stayed behind turned into shadows, older men sitting in diners at noon, reading papers they didn't finish. They still nodded to each other out of habit. They still folded money a certain way. They still looked twice before speaking. They weren't dangerous anymore. They were living echoes of a world that used to hum. The workers moved on. Dancers opened small shops. Bartenders ran neighborhood bars where nobody asked for protection. Cabbies learned to take credit cards and follow GPS voices that never argued. The city was cleaner, safer, more predictable, and strangely empty. The noise was still there, but the rhythm was gone. You could walk 10 blocks and never hear laughter from a back room. You could sit in a bar and feel nothing watching you, and somehow that felt worse. Years later, people told stories. They said the mob ran the clubs, that the city was wild, that danger made it exciting. The old ones smiled and said it wasn't about danger. It was about order. You knew who to pay, who to trust, when to close, and when to keep quiet. The night worked because everyone believed in the same small rules. When the rules disappeared, so did the warmth. Now the same streets shine with LED light instead of neon. Music comes from speakers, not stages. Bartenders press buttons instead of counting bills. People still chase the same feeling, the sense that someone's in charge, but they chase it alone. The handshake became a password, the promise a contract, the protection a policy. The city still moves, but it doesn't breathe the same. Sometimes late at night, when the traffic slows and the air feels heavy, the old rhythm returns. A bar owner pauses while locking up, hearing a sound that isn't there. A cabbie on his last fare checks the mirror twice for no reason. A woman walking home remembers a light that used to blink outside a club long gone. The night remembers, even if the people don't. Those who lived through it carry it quietly. They don't glorify it. They just know it was real. A world where trust was currency and routine was religion. They say the mob didn't just run the clubs. It kept the city human. You could hate them and still feel safer knowing they were there. Now the lights stay on by themselves. No one collects envelopes, no one keeps the order. The music plays, but nobody listens for footsteps behind the door. The night belongs to everyone and to no one. It's brighter, faster, freer, but thinner. And in that thinness you can still hear it, a faint echo under the hum of the new city, the old rhythm that once made everything work. The city didn't sleep because the mob ran the night. Now it never sleeps at all. And that's the difference.